Imagine it. You are seated at the theater skimming through a playbill when all of a sudden the curtains open up to a set filled with gorgeous plant life. You're awestruck at the sight of this, then you hear the familiar bump, 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 bump of the prologue for the musical Into the Woods. Today I'll be telling you a little bit about the life of Broadway composer and lyricist Stephen Sondheim. Did you know that most of you most likely have heard of Sondheim? You may have heard some of his music trending online. Maybe you went and supported a friend that was doing a musical and it just so happened to be a Sondheim work. Perhaps you heard of him through his Disney musical movie adaptations like West Side Story or Into the Woods. Whether or not you have heard of him through these things, there is no doubt that he led an interesting life. I personally have done a Sondheim musical recently, and through this experience I learned more about the inner workings of his musical. It also allowed me to spark an interest in learning more about him and his life. So I did research on him. Today I'll be telling you about how Sondheim was an apprentice, a student, and a composer. First, I will talk about his time as an apprentice. According to current biographies, Stephen Sondheim was an apprentice for Oscar Hammerstein II. Hammerstein was like a father to Sondheim, and they spent most of their time together. Hammerstein also introduced him to musical theater, which inspired him to write his first musical called By George. Hammerstein called it garbage. But he let him help with rehearsals, which helped him learn more about musical composition, which helped him create better pieces later on in his life. I just talked about how Stephen Sondheim was an apprentice, so now we can look at how he was a student. According to American songwriters, Stephen Sondheim went to a military academy and he went to college. The academy he attended was the New York Military Academy. He liked it there because of its large organ that had many buttons to play with. He then later on attended Williams College. There he intended to major on mathematics and get a degree in mathematics, but he ultimately decided that music was the major for him. Now that we have talked about Sondheim's apprenticeship and education, we can lastly look at his time as a composer. According to the Biography Reference Bank, Stephen Sondheim was an award-winning Broadway lyricist and composer, and he wrote many songs for shows that have had runs on Broadway. He really started his career in the 1950s when he worked with Arthur Lawrence to create the score for the hit musical West Side Story. He then had many other successes in the 60s. Some of them include Gypsy and A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. He created another hit in 1970 called Company. This musical was created to take a deep dive into the difference between married and single life. He then created more hits like Sweeney Todd, The Demon Barber of Fleet Street, and he wrote a disastrous musical called Merrily We Roll Along. But he bounced back with the creation of Sunday in the Park with George. This musical took a deep dive at the life of painter George Seurat and his famous painting, A Sunday Afternoon on the Island of Le Grand Jatte. This allowed Sondheim to show his more artistic side, and it helped him to gain 5 Tony Awards through this musical. The most recent musical he wrote was Into the Woods. This really showed Sondheim's darker, edgy side, and it showed the lives of beloved fairy tale characters and what happens when a person makes bad decisions. I hope you have enjoyed learning about Stephen Sondheim and how he was an apprentice, a student, and a composer. Maybe after hearing a little bit about his life, you'll be inspired to listen to one of his musicals.